collective unconscious. It's difficult to interpret, and it was never fully defined. Maybe it's a kind of general function of the nervous system, structured the same way in everyone, or maybe it's some external influence of an unknown source and quality that forces people to do the same things. This idea comes up when looking at major social upheavals, where large groups of people enter into sharp confrontation. People divide themselves into specific clusters, classify themselves, and these clusters oppose each other. The differences between them, at least the declared ones, become so unacceptable to the opposing groups that people end up destroying each other on a massive scale. Here's the central question. If an outside observer, completely unfamiliar with the situation, looked at such a conflict, they look for the cause in biological or physiological differences? Would they arrive at the same distinctive features that the people themselves use to define themselves? Why couldn't members of one group be together with members of the other? What separates these people from each other on some deep fundamental level? If we consider psychology as part of physiology, then people explain these confrontations to themselves, but when you're looking from the inside, you're a hostage to the situation. You have information that an outside observer doesn't have, but you don't have the ability to see the big picture. The real question is what features can be used to divide people into clusters, because classification by political or religious affiliation, which are also strongly intertwined, doesn't answer the main question. We see that the classification by which people divide into us and them works in principle, but it doesn't explain what's actually wrong. What divides people from within? What makes them confront each other? From the standpoint of natural sciences, biology, neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy, it seems that part of this must be innate and part acquired. It's difficult to talk about the innate because we don't know the criteria for inheriting ideological preferences. One could say they're hereditary to some extent, but that's more a matter of statistical observation than genetics. So it's more convenient to consider the aspect of acquisition. And what's acquired is experience, which can be interpreted in the context of conditioned reflexes. Why do people who never lived in a certain socio-political system develop sympathy for it? Because pleasant associations form with images they never saw, through memories of older generations, through cultural context, through nostalgia for something you never knew. So the first reason a person identifies with a group is a series of pleasant conditioned reflexes, pleasant associations. Social institutions also connect pleasant or unpleasant things with certain images. A person's already known pleasant associations are linked to new ones. But then the next question arises, why do such conditioned reflexes arise in one person and not in another? That brings us back to the innate. One person finds one combination of stimuli pleasant, another finds a different one pleasant. Even people in the same environment and under the same circumstances can form different cultural and ideological preferences. That is, it's lived experience superimposed on predisposition. And here's an important nuance. These preferences are often hostile to each other. Nowadays, society is moving towards reducing the percentage of overt physical aggression, but the element of confrontation is always present. Every group defines itself in opposition to another. If you take people with different predispositions and place them in a completely different cultural environment, will they divide again into groups corresponding to their original predispositions? Will the predisposition manifest differently? Will they form their own subgroups within the new environment, and how will they differ? Will they be aggressively disposed towards each other? This leads to the idea that there's something basic inside a person, a matrix onto which everything else is laid. It would be good to understand this basic thing, because it seems, is the essence of all human conflicts. Next comes another layer, cultural attitudes, and beneath them, probably, status. One could say that people are divided by status for historical reasons. And ideological preferences, to one degree or another, favor people on a certain hierarchical rung. If you possess resources, your views will reflect that. If you belong to a certain social stratum, your religious preferences will likely correlate with that position. Correlations are known between belief systems and levels of well-being, and they have historical and geographical reasons connected to natural conditions and the economic development of regions. So status initially strongly influences which camp a person joins. But if a person adjusts their values, especially such unshakable ones, to their status, then what's the point of them? Although the most vehement, those in the extremes often do change their affiliation. That falls into the realm of psychopathology, where life follows the principle of idealization and devaluation. First they idealize, then they devalue everything they can get their hands on. But overall, a person tends to adjust their values to their capabilities. Is that so? Can people be classified by their predisposition, by what they're more inclined towards? Physiologically, this aspect must exist. It's strange that almost no one studies this. Although probably there are scientific works that consider a certain psychotype as more prone to certain views. But this will always be statistics, correlation, and psychotype itself is a division that says very little. Temperaments, accentuations, modern typologies, any classification has a practical side. It's not entirely clear what many political labels mean, because everyone names themselves as they wish, and historically the same terms could denote opposite things. But let's return to something deeper, to religion. Many outstanding thinkers and scientists were believers. The discussion here is not about the existence of the divine, but about the phenomenon itself as a social, biological, psychological phenomenon, as a certain quality of our population. Before modern humans, there were several species of humans. Only we remain. It's unknown whether other species had analogous phenomena, and it's even unknown whether there were populations of our species that didn't have this quality. Civilization was built by those who possessed it, the feeling or knowledge that there's some higher power around which a mythological system is created. One way to approach religion rationally is to start from the most fundamental level. The definition of self-cause. By self-cause is meant that whose essence involves existence, or that whose nature cannot be conceived except as existing. This is difficult at first glance, but only that which cannot be conceived as non-existing can be called a self-cause. Everything around us can be conceived as non-existing. Even the universe, as scientists say, will at some point cease to be in the form it is now. But a self-cause is something that cannot be conceived otherwise than as existing. Usually we think that everything has a cause, every phenomenon has a preceding phenomenon. But there are things that are the cause of themselves. Next comes the definition of the finite. That thing is called finite, which can be limited by another thing of the same nature. Body is limited by body, thought by thought. But body is not limited by thought, nor thought by body. One could discuss materialism at length here, but the point is that the only thing that is a self-cause, according to this view, is the absolute. An entity that exists not because someone created it, but because its very nature already implies existence. To simplify as much as possible, the absolute is that which cannot not exist. In this context, it's difficult to contradict. It postulates, there must undoubtedly be something that cannot possibly not exist, and this is the absolute. Next comes the concept of substance. By substance is meant that which exists in itself, and is conceived through itself. The conception of it does not require the conception of another thing. Substance here is the absolute, the primordially existing, self-determining entity. This, by the way, is present in many esoteric and religious mythologisms, where the primordial gives birth to itself. A paradoxical explanation, the point of which is just to create a sense of incomprehensibility, like the sound of one hand clapping. But here it said, substance exists in itself, is not in another. Then comes attribute, that which the intellect perceives of substance as constituting its essence. Infinity and self-sufficiency are also attributes. And mode, the affections of substance. If substance is reality in general, then modes are concrete things. Man is a mode of substance, he doesn't exist by himself. Finally, the definition of the absolute, an absolutely infinite being, a substance consisting of infinite attributes. And how can one argue with such a definition? What can be said here about the absolute? In the consciousness of a believer, this is not a typical perception, because there's no personality here. The divine is usually perceived as a personality, much higher than man, but a personality that can interact with man on his level, send him signals, act within a system of moral values. Although the moral values of the deity have changed all the time, because man himself defined them. Here, however, there's no hint of personality. If we consider religion from a behaviorist perspective, we have to acknowledge that we cannot speak about the inner experiences of a subject, because that's inaccessible to us. Only observation is accessible. We don't know what's going on in another's consciousness. Probably there's an internal process that seems important and sacred to the bearer. But from a behaviorist point of view, this process has specific function, and we cannot characterize this phenomenon except through the function it mediates. Religion mediates a huge number of functions, and probably they were very necessary for us in evolution. A society without such internal structures wouldn't have survived. The very mechanism by which these functions are realized isn't fully understood. The sensations that arise in a person seem supremely significant to them. An analogy can be drawn with a cell membrane. For a substance to penetrate the membrane, a concentration difference is needed. If this substance possessed consciousness, this attraction would seem to it supremely powerful and sacred. But we understand the mechanism. In the case of religious experience, the mechanism is unclear to us. Like in quantum science, we look deeper, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, and further we can't look, but something mediates their mechanism. It's the same with religion. Something mediates the mechanism that forces people to perform rituals, experience certain sensations, and incline towards certain actions. Much is said about the governing function of religion. The active part of believers, even if they're not the majority, largely determines the movement of society. It's said that religion is fading, people are becoming less religious, but the critical mass, it seems, is still there. Another view explains religion as a kind of hygiene of the psyche. Like brushing your teeth or washing your hands, for many people, belonging to a religious structure and unity with others is important for mental health. Honestly, it seems that there are no non-religious people at all. This quality is just realized differently in everyone. There's an observation that religiosity is an element of magical thinking, and when it reaches a boiling point, it becomes pathological. Everything has a pathological limit. Like stomach acidity, it's needed for digestion, but when elevated, it becomes critical. A distinction can be made. If you talk to higher powers, it's normal within the framework of religion. If higher powers talk to you, it's already pathology. Although there are nuances, if a person socializes and leads society, become under of a teaching. That is, prophets are probably isolated cases of borderline states, which may have been necessary at certain stages. And more on the purpose of religion. The absence of belief is often discussed by young people in the prime of life. It seems that most people lack a sensory understanding of the finiteness of life. Even those who declare an absence of belief still, apparently, have a feeling that something exists after death. This is a personal conviction, but it appears that virtually all people in our population have this property, to believe that something else will follow. Religion, in this case, is a mechanism that strengthens you in this belief. Does it, people? Probably yes. Many ancient societies viewed life as a preparation for death, because it's inevitable. It's something that approaches with every second. Observing those who are passing, it seems impossible not to feel that something exists beyond. The very essence of the human psyche is formed in such a way that it doesn't believe in its own finiteness. This, it seems, underlies a large number of interpopulation interactions. For example, the capacity for self-sacrifice inherent in the human species, the willingness to sacrifice oneself for the group. This can be explained by a special instinct associated with disintegration. It's also possible that the image of a higher being is simply the image of a parental figure extrapolated to a higher level. But it might be a richer, more archetypal image. One could stop somewhere in the middle. There's some mechanism that gives a person a feeling of faith, unity, sacred sacrifice. In many religious traditions, there's an element not of denying death, but of the necessity and importance of death for higher values. This can be viewed as a mechanism that was important for the survival and development of the population at a certain stage, and it's unclear how we'll behave further. The qualities of the human psyche probably progress or change, but it's difficult to track because we have no objective data on the inner world of people who lived thousands of years ago. We don't know the intensity of their experiences. It seems that the number of people capable of being deeply imbued with religious feeling and performing collective actions under it is decreasing over time, but it's still not below a critical mass. Now, after all these reflections on religion, psyche, and human nature, we need to return to the beginning, to the understanding of freedom. Because one particular understanding of freedom is very unusual and important for understanding everything else. Freedom can be defined this way. That thing is called free which exists solely by the necessity of its own nature and is determined to action by itself alone. That thing is called necessary, or rather compelled, which is determined by another thing to exist and to act. The meaning of freedom in this understanding depends on whether the cause of the thing's existence is within it or outside it. This distinguishes between things based on the source of the cause of their existence and action. Freedom is complete causal self-sufficiency. That is, a thing is free when, to explain why it exists and acts the way it does, it's sufficient to refer to the thing itself. If a reference to another thing is required, such a thing is compelled. This distinction doesn't concern the subject's experiences or free will, but a more fundamental basic level, the structure of explanation. What does it mean to exist by the necessity of its own nature? It means that the existence or properties of the thing follow from what it is. Necessity here means the absence of alternatives, but this necessity isn't imposed from without, but stems from the very essence of the thing. An example from mathematics. From the definition of a triangle, it follows that the sum of its angles is 180 degrees. This property can't be otherwise. It follows from the structure of the triangle, not from some external influence. The opposite, the shape of a material object after an external impact, is explained by the impact itself, not by the internal nature of the object. From such examples, a certain interpretation emerges. The general law, the structure, is self-sufficient and independent of conditions, therefore free. The particular case, the concrete event, depends on conditions, therefore unfree. In this reading, freedom coincides with the level of generality. The more general a thing is, the freer it is. The more particular, the more compelled it is. Hence the conclusion, fundamental truths turn out to be free, while concrete realizations are always unfree. This might seem correct, but it could be distorting the original thought. Why might this not be the actual position, although it looks correct? The division might run not along the line general, particular, but along the line self-caused, causally dependent. Generality by itself guarantees nothing. The general can be unfree, and the particular free, if the source of the cause coincides with the thing itself. Examples that don't confuse levels are needed. For instance, some general law may depend on more fundamental laws, that is, be general but not self-sufficient. A free thing here is that which exists and acts through itself. What is that? A mathematical law doesn't act, it describes action. There's exactly one free thing that is neither an abstraction nor a concept, the absolute. Nature as a single real whole. This isn't a metaphor or a generalization, but a concrete ontological reality. God or nature. Man, in principle, isn't free, because the nature of any man is determined by an infinite chain of preceding causes. The only really existing free thing is the absolute, which contains its own existence within itself. From the definition, it follows that freedom and necessity aren't opposed here. The opposite of freedom isn't necessity, but external determination. In the common understanding, freedom and necessity are often opposed. You're free to do some things, not others. But this descends to a more sick level. There are other ways to see it. One view connects freedom with conscious choice and goal setting. An action is considered free whose source is in the agent itself and which is performed for a meaningful purpose. For example, a person reflects on possible actions and chooses one based on their idea of the good. The opposite, an action performed under external compulsion or out of ignorance, isn't considered free. Unlike freedom to the presence of alternatives and practical reason. This isn't necessarily a contradiction, it's just using different conceptual tools. Another view distinguishes between natural causality and moral freedom. In the world of nature, everything is subject to necessity, whereas freedom belongs to reason as the ability to initiate actions independently of natural causes. These thoughts arose long before the advent of modern neuroscience. A turning point, probably, was the beginning of the 20th century, when people delved deeper into the causes of their behavior. Depth psychology showed that our actions are partly caused by unconscious processes, meaning the degree of freedom is limited. In earlier times, people couldn't look so deeply into themselves due to the lack of tools and methods. An example from this view: a person acts contrary to their inclinations, guided by the moral law. Freedom is the ability to restrain one's natural impulses. The opposite, behavior fully explainable by psychological or physiological reasons, isn't considered free in the moral sense. This allows a break in the chain of natural causality, whereas the first view considers such a break impossible. What does this break mean? There's a fundamental distinction between two orders. Natural causality: everything that happens in nature, including physiology, psyche, desires, is subject to the law of cause and effect. Emotions and drives have natural causes and can be explained as a natural process, and a natural process isn't free. And according to the first view, by the way, it's also not free, since the only free object is the absolute. But this second view introduces another type of causality, the causality of reason, when a person acts out of respect for the moral law. Importantly, this isn't suppressing one impulse with another, stronger one, but subjecting oneself to a norm that isn't a fact of nature. Why might the first view consider such a break impossible? In that view, any action of body, soul, reason, desire will has a cause, and this cause in turn has another cause. This reasons much more deeply, anticipating the modern scientific approach. Reason as an extranatural source of causes doesn't exist. Reason is part of nature, not an exception to it. Therefore, for this view, the break isn't freedom, but a lack of explanation. The other view insists that if a moral action were explained by character, upbringing, or psychology, it would cease to be moral. Morality is placed outside the biological framework. That is, there's something in us not subject to biology, and that something is morality. It's possible only if a person could have acted differently under the same natural conditions. Therefore, freedom here isn't an empirical fact, but a necessary condition for moral responsibility. Yet another view affirms the compatibility of freedom and causal necessity. Freedom is understood here as the ability to act according to one's desires without external compulsion. This is closer to the first alternative view, but on a more social level. For example, a person walks because they want to. Free, a person is dragged by force, not free. This retains the practical, everyday concept of freedom, whereas the first view considers it philosophically insufficient. Comparing these, one view allows that there's something extra-natural, morality. Another says a break is impossible, because everything is nature. And here one could add a fourth position, from the standpoint of modern science. It's known that a complex neurochemical dynamics determines everything, both desires and what we call morality. But we have no tools to